it kind of gives you the outlook of what it is. So what this shows you is, if you look at U.S. economic engagement to the world, more specifically to the emerging markets, in 1970, 70% of financial flows, and there are some folks who actually redefine this number to be as high as 90%, has been mostly what we call official development assistance, which essentially is government money that you send as development assistance, as foreign assistance to emerging markets. And about 30% was actually private. If you now look at recent times, the data is now flipped, meaning 90% of it is private sector, is 10% of it is and if you actually look at what that 10% is, if you take out countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, these kind of big foreign policy priorities right now, that number even dwindles even much, much lower. So what happens in our foreign policy model is that we're still stuck in this 1970 model, thinking that most of US economic engagement around the world is actually US government money floating in the world, floating in these markets. But in reality, what it is that we have now a lot more actors, a lot more both development actors and diplomacy actors playing a very active role in foreign policy. So then we can't pretend that they don't exist and focus only on government-to-government relations. So that is essentially our intention, or our focus to work with the private sector is not in some kind of liberal sentiment that we all kumbaya, let's all work together kind of things, which is important, but it's actually driven by reality. What they say is data doesn't lie. When you look at these numbers, then it's no longer kind of a side item what you could say, oh, it's important that the private sector is there. No, they do more than what governments do. So we need to make sure that we can collaborate with them in those ways. Actually, even better data, this is from 2015, it shows you, this is 2010 data, but there's always a lag period. This actually breaks down the number that I showed you earlier, the 2010 number. It breaks it down what that looks. So in terms, so the official development assistance I told you is right, it's like 9%. And what foundations do, corporations, voluntary organizations, all these things are right there. And in the US side, which is quite unique, if you look at the second highest flows is US remittances, which is about almost 30%, which is essentially migrant communities, diaspora groups, whether they're Ghanaian Americans, whether they are Taiwanese Americans, whatever they are, they're sending a lot of money to other places. So this is not just about corporations, it actually also involves citizens who are actually engaging in essentially diplomacy work. So this is, I'm sure researchers in your own respective economy here can actually, I'm sure your data will mimic this. And we looked at other markets like the UK and others, we saw a very similar trend. This is not unique to America. Most places, most developed economies have similar breakdown of data set that shows that the private sector plays a very, very active role in the business of foreign diplomacy. The Office of Global Partnerships was set up by former Secretary Condi Rice in 2008. There was a study was commissioned. There was what we called an advisory committee of distinguished Americans who came together and studied the data and gave advice to the secretary to say, the data I showed you earlier is the trend, it's the way of the future. So therefore the department should think about setting up an office that engages with the private sector. So what that means is that you have the same as in our State Department, in your own in MOFA, you have departments who would deal with regional offices. We, in our side, we didn't have anybody who was dealing with governments. I mean, with private companies or private organizations. When you have that kind of data, they found it that it would be paramountly important, not just to say we should be doing it, but we should set up an office whose sole focus is not to deal with governments. We have a lot of colleagues who do that, my own colleagues who are in this building. But how do we deal with the private sector? So that's the thing. And our first agenda is obviously is the president's advance of the president's foreign policy agenda through the private sector. Second one is we are kind of a rapid response unit for the Secretary of State. What that means is that when you come across problems, whether they're natural disasters or some type of crisis happen, governments inherently are slow to respond. Because if you need to put money, resources, at least on the US side, you have to go to Congress, get appropriations, and there's a very long lag period of time. But when it comes to the private sector, if they care, they're able to respond much more quickly and much more at ease than we do. And so we become that for the Secretary of State. So he or she is traveling around the world and they see a problem and they want to see if the private sector could help. It is our office who gets contacted by the Secretary to say, I have this problem in this country with this kind of issue. What can you do to actually help with this problem? And doing that. So we're essentially like anybody else. I mean, I don't know how you regard yourself. We all are diplomats here. But your job is to problem solve, right? If there is no problems around the world, you wouldn't have a job.